afternoon, everyone. I am Sunju Kim, Harvard Yenching Professor of Korean History at the Department of East Asian Languages and Civilizations at Harvard University. I'd like to extend warm welcome to everyone to this event, Korean Treasures at Harvard series. Here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, it's been a very cold, wet, gray day. So it is very nice that we have today's event online, I think. And it is our great pleasure to continue to offer this series, Korean Treasures at Harvard, which we began in the fall of 2020 during the pandemic, with an aim to showcase precious artworks, rare books, and others that Harvard museums and libraries have, and also how scholars have been using these objects for their own very creative research. This series is recorded and available through Korea Institute's Vimeo and YouTube channels. Currently, there are 13 recorded talks, including those presenting highlights from Harvard Yenching Library and Harvard Art Museums. And if you missed any of those presentations and like to watch them, use the link to these channels, which is sent over through chat, or simply you can search Google with search word Korean Treasures at Harvard. I'd like to note that this series, including today's presentation, has been sponsored by the Jeffrey D. and Jean K. Lee Fund at the Korea Institute, Harvard University. And our speaker today is Dr. Hyeok Kang, Assistant Professor of East Asian Languages and Cultures at Washington University in St. Louis since 2021. And as some of you know, Professor Kang received his PhD degree from our own program, Harvard, in 2020, with a prize-winning dissertation from the International Convention of Asia Scholars. In addition, he received many other prizes for his papers, conference presentations, and the book project he's currently working on now. He's also a recipient of numerous fellowships. Just to highlight a few, a dissertation completion fellowship from Mellon ACLS, postdoctoral fellowship awarded by D. Kim Foundation for the History of Science and Technology in East Asia, and another ACLS fellowship just past academic year to support his work on a current book. In Professor Kang's research on the history of science and technology and global material culture has appeared in top-notch peer-reviewed journals such as ISIS, a Journal of the History of Science Society, History and Technology, Journal of Cultural Analytics, and the Journal of Asian Studies and others. And another article is soon to appear in the Journal of World History. So definitely Professor Kang has been very, very productive. His current book project is titled Artisanal Heart, Artificer, which I should be asking about later, Statecraft and Technology in Early Modern Korea. And this is an examination of the culture of material design and production in Joseon, Korea. Today's talk, titled The Wicked Factory, Artisans, Ethics, and Reform in 16th Century Joseon, is, I believe, a part of this ongoing book project. What's fascinating to me about Professor Kang's research is that he's working on the area that is not so well known to us, including artisans and the technological innovations and advancements they made during the Joseon dynasty, as well as their relationship with the officials, scholars, and the state. So Today's presentation is more exciting because he will showcase some of these exciting discoveries and also in connection with his findings, some of the books that we have at the Harvard Yenching Library. So warm welcome to Professor Kang. Floor is yours now.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon. Thank you for the kind introduction, Professor Kim, and for hosting this talk. I'd also like to thank Chan and the KI for coordinating, and Ms. Kang Mi-kyung and others at the Harvard Yenching Library for help with procuring images for this talk. And a warm welcome to everyone in the audience. I look forward to your questions and comments. So today, I'm presenting a portion of my book manuscript, which is about artisanal creativity and material culture in Joseon, Korea. But this talk is actually inspired by a rare item stored at the Harvard Yenching Library, titled The Collected Works of Yang Eunjung. This work was central to my reimagining of the relationship between artisans, ethics, and reform in 16th century Korea. And I'm not seeing my video, actually. I'm getting just a black screen. So let me just see. Let me turn that off and let me turn it on. It'll work. Can you see me at all or no? Oh, here I'm back. Okay. All good? Okay. Alrighty. And so without further ado, let us begin. Can you see the slide? Okay, great. In early 16th century, when Neo-Confucian ideology was sweeping across Korean society, a scholar named Yang Eunjung answered the following essay prompt. Administered by the Joseon court, the prompt appeared in the civil service examination and addressed a crucial issue faced by the government at the time, the problem of what I've called the wicked factory in this talk. The examiners wrote, today, while reviewing artisan names on government rosters, one cannot help but think that the artisans are lazy and not accomplished in their occupation. In fact, some have even cut off their fingers to leave the factories, but this is all but a deception, to turn to private enterprises in the marketplace. How can we make them return and dedicate themselves to official office service? Apparently, scholars at the time lamented about a decline in the state factories. This, in their view, was symptomatic of a general loss of morality in society. Korean artisans were no longer diligent, skilled, and loyal to the court. They disobeyed orders and withheld techniques from their apprentices. They prioritized their profit over that of the government, shirking duties. And they even schemed to leave the factory by using injury as an excuse to turn to more lucrative opportunities in the marketplace. One official concluded thus, the artisans of today all exist in name and not in substance. When I first encountered this exam prompt in the collected works of Yang Eunjung stored at the Harvard Yenching Library, I was over the moon. The prompt itself, as far as I know, has not survived in other forms or literary collections, although there are other copies of this work in South Korea. I'm currently writing a book about artisanal creativity and the relationship between statecraft and technology in Korea. And this source provided a precious glimpse into the little-studied 16th century. How did leading scholars of the day think about the artisans and their relationship to Confucian ethics, scholarship, and statecraft? As I tried to answer this question, however, I was left with a profound confusion. On the one hand, the data seem to fit perfectly with existing scholarship on the matter, which has emphasized the decline of manufacture. According to Kang Gil and other recent historians, the state factory was fast collapsing. Especially during the reigns of King Yeonsanggun and Chungjeong, there were quote unquote many inherent inconsistencies, including low salaries for the artisans, the corruption of supervising officials, and the foot dragging of artisans. This, they argued, led to the beginning of the withering of the Joseon state. Filling its vacuum then were so-called private artisans, or sajang, who rose to the occasion. These were artisan turned merchants who worked independently in the marketplace. They would lead developments in industry and commerce in the subsequent centuries. As I took Yang's own essays seriously, however, I found many hints to the contrary. Eventually, an alternative reading emerged, which was that, in fact, there was a renewal of interest in artisanship and a deep imperative for reform during this period. The scholar's thoughtful answer clarifies that the officials of his day were actively devising solutions. For example, Yang suggested that the court offer competing salaries to the artisans. He criticized that the supervising officials were the root of the problem, not the artisans. Yang even noted that all craftspeople, official and private, need to be espoused as a way to show Confucian reciprocity towards the people and their livelihood. The key, he argued, was to promote craft, or 권공. So what exactly was happening in factories, right? And how were these changes indicative of broader shifts in Korean society and state? The more I read Yang's essay, and in connection with many other literary writings, government records, and legal statutes, I realized that this conundrum challenges our understanding of the 16th century as a whole, and perhaps even the supposed effects of Korean Confucianism. To date, a few scholars have examined Yang, but no one considered his philosophy of artisanship in connection with the actual government policy. They also did not consider the actual conditions of manufacture during the 16th century. Hence, we've been stuck with the overall narrative of the period, which has been predominantly one of decline. Writing of this period in the language of stagnation and isolation, Song Eun-sub, Kang Eun-cheon, and others questioned why Joseon alone experienced an, quote, unusual serenity, which cannot be found elsewhere in the 16th century world, unquote. Their answer was that while in appearance, Joseon was extremely tranquil, they had an inward-looking transformation epitomized by the rise of Neo-Confucianism in society, and the emphasis on self-cultivation and morality. Intellectual historian Park Byung-yoon painted this so-called Neo-Confucian utopia in conspicuously somber tones. There was an ascendancy of abstract ethics at courtly debates, he argued, and the retreat of knowledgeable experts with concrete administrative capacity. Another historian was even more specific. The Construction Bureau faced an extinction of expert construction managers, which he argued was caused by the rise of Neo-Confucian scholars and the growing importance of civil service degrees as the criterion for political service. Today, I will argue the opposite. The state factories were not so much in decline as undergoing deep reform. To be sure, significant challenges threatened the system, but that had to do with the entanglement of Korean artisans with regional and later global transformations in commerce, and not their isolation from the world. Also, when this entanglement proved problematic, bringing in part some of the issues mentioned above about the shop floor, it was overcome with a marriage of ethics and expertise, not their estrangement. Well-rounded experts advanced and appeared at court, not abstract scholars. Indeed, we see compelling glimpses of such officials collaborating with artisans across different fields, from hat making and clock making to decorative metalwork. By the mid-century, narratives about artisanship even shifted. Some scholars embraced artisanship as an ethical practice, while artisans, through their craft, were no longer wicked. They were virtuous and embodied Confucian frugality and morality. So in the rest of my talk, I will demonstrate this in three parts. First, I'll talk about the onset of the problem of the wickedness. Second, how it was formulated and addressed through reform. And finally, I'll share some vignettes of the reform factories and their broader social and political consequences. Now, let's begin with some wickedness, which had, in fact, a lot to do with this shiny white metal, silver. During 1510s, the introduction of Korean silver into the Chinese economy brought about a sea change in the Seoul marketplace. Silver ingots like this had become main currency in Ming China, and Chinese consumption of silver was so immense that it sucked like a vacuum much of the existing silver stock around the world. From Korea, Japan, and later the New World, especially places like Potosi in Bolivia, unprecedented amounts of silver flowed into China. In return, China's immense exports, including silks, ceramics, and much more, flowed out through East Asian and European intermediaries. The whole world seemed to be united by silver, and economic historians have argued that the modern capitalist world was born at this time, and as they put it, with the silver spoon. Few historians know, however, that this global revolution had a quiet beginning in Chosun. In 1503, Seoul, about half a century before Japan became a leading producer, and a century before American silver flooded Asia, Korean artisans mastered a new method of refining silver that proved transformative. This brings us to King Yeonsan-gun, a strong icon of wickedness in Korean history. 3 years before he was overthrown by his half-brother Jungjong, the prodigal king set a new pattern of material production and consumption into motion. Other than denigrating Confucius, killing literary dissenters, and indulging in women and lavish palaces, Yeonsan-gun flew in the face of convention regarding craftwork. If the Confucian injunction was not to dally with things because it could kill one's will, 완물상지, the king brazenly tasked the artisans to make an endless stream of things. These were objects of so-called licentious ingenuity or umgyo, such as exotic pearls, ice sculptures, screen panels, mercury gilt armor. For our purposes, the king loved silver, and various silver work ensued, like spoons, coffers, plates, and chalices. During this process, artisans Kim Gambul and Gomdong stepped into the limelight of history. In order to relieve the silver famine at court, they devised a new method of refining the metal, which proved important in Korea and later Japan. As described in the annals, they presented high-quality silver refined by the addition of lead ingots, which is a very key component of the technology of silver copulation. And they boasted that there will now be plenty of silver to use based on their technique. The Kims did not disappoint. When the king and his officials had their technique tested in the Dancheon mine and various other counties of Hamgyong province, the technology of silver copulation spread quickly. Like a Pandora's box, however, the silver mine, once opened, could not be closed fast enough. In fact, by allowing the private extraction of these mines and similar activities in the factories located in Seoul, Yeonsan-gun opened the floodgates of what his successors would associate, understandably, with immorality and decline. For one thing, under the next reign, a mining rush overtook the northeastern province, turning it into a hotbed of private smelters and smugglers. The artisans who flocked to the region extracted the silver, supplied it to the great merchants of Seoul, who in turn shipped the white metal to China with the help of interpreters and other officials at court. We don't have good statistics on output yet, but we know that this enterprise grew deeply entrenched considering the way Chinese responded. Growing concern about the volume of silver coming in from Korea, they restricted the access of Korean envoys to freely roam and trade in the capital, Mungum, They even posed on their own civil service exams the problem of the Chosun Koreans as the essay prompt. How should the Chinese court solve the problem of the Koreans who, quote unquote, use the false pretense of ritual propriety to frequently visit our court, whose true motive lies in profiting from trade? China wasn't the only neighbor affected. In fact, the technique of the Kims spread to Japan. As mining historians in Japan have shown in detail, artisans like Gyeongsu and Jongdan transmitted their knowledge to the archipelago, which was far richer in ores. Soon, Iwami Ginzan and other mines became so prolific that they put out a third of the world's production of silver, supplying at one point up to 40% of China's total imports. Now, if extravagance and wealth are a recipe for wickedness, this silver boom in Korea and Japan brought some of that back to Seoul. Contrary to common wisdom, which laments that the Koreans relinquished the opportunity to reap the benefits of the Silver Age, evidence actually suggests that they got a pretty good deal. Because of the asymmetrical trade between China and Japan, much of the silver that was mined in Japan was in turn shipped to China via the Korean merchants. This meant that the Korean merchants got rich, and they moved at least 400,000 taels or 15 metric tons, which is a conservative estimate, to China and enjoyed handsome margins. Indeed, records show that the Seoul marketplace burst with activity, and luxury goods from China piled up in the homes of aristocrats and merchants. Everyone from yangban down to slaves wanted these things, and the artisans who could remake them became highly sought after. Like a siren's temptation, the growing market then lured the artisans away from the factory and into the private sector where these opportunities awaited them. If only they could reverse engineer the Chinese techniques of metal gilding on these gold coronets, for example, there will surely be a profitable business. Furniture made with black lacquer, Hyeok was likewise irresistible, as was blue calico, originally from South Asia, which was becoming popular amongst the Chinese elites. Now, if we believe the officials who lamented about this phenomenon, some artisans indeed turned bad. According to state regulation, artisans were supposed to work at the factories and take a tax cut for the number of days they worked. Yet, because the marketplace became more lucrative, some shirked their duties and pretended that they were injured as an excuse. The remaining workers in the factories then became disillusioned because they had to fill in for the vacancies of their peers. And added to this, the records say that they became lazy, incapable of delivering goods on time, and disobedient to their supervisors. Prominent statesman Kim An-ro described this as the decadent habits of artisans and went further. Even if there is an official who strives in every way to encourage and motivate them, the artisans do not follow instructions or change their habits. Instead, they resent the strict supervision, often harboring schemes to slander the official. Who then would dare to risk the anger of the workmen and exert effort in such a situation? If this continues, there will be no one left willing to serve the state's affairs. After this, Kim Han-ro also portrays this problem as indicative of a general decline in society. In other words, the Chosun factories, a microcosm of the commercializing society, were in deep crisis. But was it? Returning to Yang Eun-jung's essay, I found another more convincing story about the effects of Silver Age in Korea. Remarkably, Yang noted that the artisans had no fault in all this. They were not the problem, but the victims. They had been abused by the immoral officials at the factories who needed to be purged. Yang wrote that there was a circle of such officials, high and low. Petty officials at the factories abused the artisan rosters to run their private businesses. Behind their backs then were so-called money-grubbing ministers or powerful elites who crookedly took their side. Together, these officials siphoned away resources from the government factories and lined their own pockets. Yang does not call out names, given perhaps the sensitive nature of the subject. But when I began to read into other records and literary compilations, it became clear that Kim Han-ro, the same minister above who criticized the artisans, was one of them. Kim was a major culprit and a hypocrite. While he complained about the artisans and their decadence, he himself was driving them to an extreme. In fact, Kim had a bad reputation in China for being a merchant minister because he was running a domestic business in Korea with interpreters and merchants. Under his direction, for instance, the official envoy to China in 1537 exported much silver in exchange for up to 1.65 tons of tin ingots. This metal was rare in Korea and used in casting, brassware, bells, cannon, and so on. And evidence suggests that he was tasking the government artisans to run a private metalworking workshop. One observer noted that, quote, artisans always flowed in and out ceaselessly from his home, end quote. Another added that, quote, if for even a single day the artisans do not show up at his home due to illness or accidents, he had their supervising officials flog them, unquote. Remarkably, this is exactly the kind of behavior that Yang criticized in his essay. He wrote that the officials were exploiting the artisans, taking them as their own slaves, and tasking them in their own workshops. They then failed to give the artisans their wages and instead colluded with the supervisors to demand their obedience. So how then did the Joseon court mitigate the situation? Obviously, firing one official wouldn't solve the problem, as the problem was deeper, right? As for Yang, he offered two words, promote craft. In concrete terms, he wrote that the king should take pity on the artisans and fire the corrupt officials. Also, he recommended that capable officials are employed and better salaries are offered to the craftspeople. Finally, he even noted that although some artisans may seem pernicious, they too must be embraced because none could go lacking. This included the private artisans who fled from the factories. It included also the specialists of so-called licentious techniques, right? The techniques that weren't sanctioned by the sages or described in the Confucian classics like carpentry and bow making, who nonetheless deserved mercy. And this is what Jungjong did. In fact, well before Yang had written his essay, reforms were underway. Already in the 1520s, a group of upright officials called for a revival of the handicrafts. After sitting in royal lectures, poring through the classics about its discussion of artisanship, these officials, including Seohu, Iheng, Kim Yang-jin, and others, made clear that the artisans were eminently worthy of the court's support. Their landmark memorial in 1523 went as follows. Welcoming the artisans is one of 9 essential codes of Confucian governance, as prescribed in the Doctrine of the Mean. Here, to welcome means to invite them to the factories, allowing them to prosper in their livelihood. Generally, the craftspeople toil with their bodies and bring benefit to the profitable usage of things. Their contribution is great. Previously, our dynasty gave them bureaucratic positions and salaries, and this way of welcoming them was extremely well accomplished. Clearly, the officials were a proponent of the craftspeople, and they advocated for restoring this practice from the previous century under King Jungjong's reign. And shortly, a series of reforms followed. First, Jungjong increased salaries. Quote, the compensation for the handicraftspeople must match the quality of their work. Saying this, he cited a phrase from the school sayings of Confucius. Second, the king and the officials bolstered artisan enrollment by emphasizing merit in the selection of workers. If there are vacancies of crucial artisans, the king ordered, they may be filled with those capable, including but not limited to soldiers, support taxpayers, government servants without duties, and public slaves, end quote. Next, they reinstated the artificers, leaders of the artisans. In the 1510s, during an anti-corruption campaign led by Cho Gwang-jo, many officials at the factories were fired. including the artificers. It was important, however, not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Thus, Chungjong restored these managers and their stipend posts. This, he explained, was so that, quote, the 100 crafts can flourish and become extremely ingenious, end quote. Fourth, the king reinforced artisanal training with new discipline. As for those who do not accomplish their skill, he ordered, set a time limit for them to learn. If they do not learn diligently, consult with the instructing artificer regarding their punishment for disobeying orders, end quote. Generally, this meant, according to the legal statutes, 50 lashes to the buttocks. Chungjong also continued to crack down on corruption. Specifically, he outlawed the practice by officials to take the artisans as their own personal slaves, or kusa. And under the new rule, for every artisan involved, 40 beatings was to be given to the corrupt official and not the artisan. Last but not least, the king employed well-rounded officials armed with both ethics and expertise. He ordered that all employees of institutions with artisans must be well-rounded. Quote, from ministers down to low-ranking officials and artificers, those who know construction should be employed at the Construction Bureau. Those who understand artisan should be employed at the Ministry of Works. Those who can draw should be at the Royal Bureau of Painting. Those who appreciate music at the Academy of Music, and so on and so on. Now, there's still more to be said here, but the question lingers as to whether these reforms worked, right? Did they solve the perceived problem of state manufacture? I argue yes. In fact, they went further. Let me now share some vignettes of the reform factories in the mid-16th century. During and after the craft reforms, the factories showed great dynamism. Also, a new alliance between scholars and artisans emerged, which led to a turnabout in the narrative trope about artisans and ethics. First, take the court's embrace of all kinds of craftspeople. As suggested by Yang, Chungjong opened the doors of artisanal service to private artisans, private slaves, and even foreigners. This made for a more inclusive and dynamic pattern of production in the factories. For example, during the 1530s, the state arranged a team of official and private artisans to reverse engineer Chinese metalworking technology. At the time, Chungjong dispatched an accomplished metalworker at the factory and the best artisans he could find in the marketplace together on a trip to China. There were so many things to be learned, and over many trips, including how to do black lacquer, white copper smelting, gilt brass, gilt silver, and so on. But the central mission was to import decorative metalwork techniques, such as the technique of brass gilding required to make these coronets. The result was success, and the gilt coronets actually become a fixture in Korean official fashion for centuries to come. Another example is water clock making. Since the 15th century, makers of water clocks or clepsydras worked at the Bureau of Astronomy, where they devised these timekeeping instruments to aid with celestial observation. But the water clocks broke down often, and they needed maintenance and improvement over time. Importantly, under Chungjong's reign, even a private slave could become appointed to lead the task. Park Se-ryong, who was a private slave, but, quote, the most ingenious among the artisans, unquote, became a resident expert at the Bureau. Working with astronomers, he in fact bequeaths us with the only extant example of water clocks from the early Joseon era, which is pictured on the right here. Briefly, I want to mention that the factories welcomed foreign artisans, which actually has a long tradition. We find in this period that they actively learned from Chinese lacquerers and cannon makers who became shipwrecked on the peninsula, as well as Japanese gunsmiths and coppersmiths who received positions at the factories or rewards in return for their services. Now, I want to shift from artisans to scholars, and where we find another indicator of successful reform, which is a constant stream of capable scholars and artificers throughout the century. These officials collaborated efficiently with the artisans in the state factories. Hohu, whom I mentioned earlier, a Neo-Confucian master, crafted new bombs, crossbows, and discussed Mongol siege machines with their artisans and officials alike. Che Mu-il, expert painter, helped with the calibration of astronomical instruments at the Bureau of Astronomy. Cho Song, scholar official interested in lacquer, collaborated with the artisans to decode a Chinese book on lacquer making. And Kim Dae-kwan, an artificer, was excellent at cannon making and reverse engineered new designs that were being brought into Korea by the pirates in the East China Sea. The overarching point here is that these officials were well-rounded. As one of them put it, they mastered Confucian learning and realized practical administration. Or in other accounts, they had a skillful mind, were proficient in the study of measures and numbers, and were extremely ingenious. And these officials were also good people. They were simple and honest in nature, and they modeled filial piety and generous friendship. As a result, the records say that even the artificers did not correct them, and all the workmen followed their orders. And finally, all this led to a reversal about the trope about the artisans. No longer wicked, they were virtuous. And among those vouching for them were Korea's most well-known Confucians, Yi Hwang and Yi Yi. Founder of Joseon's first royally chartered private academy, Yi Hwang welcomed an iron maker named Bae Sun into the Sosu Academy in Punggi, modern-day Yeongju. There, the artisan supposedly read Neo-Confucian texts alongside other literati, and as a result, the story goes, he came to deeply understand and practice the virtues of frugality and integrity. In his shop, he did not deceive his customers by hiding defects in his products, as others were prone to do so by, the records say, by secretly filling the cracks with clay, the fixing leaks with wax. Rather, Bae frankly lowered the prices. He also liked to keep bees at home, but he was careful not to exploit them. He took only a modest amount, avoiding excess while harvesting. In fact, the moral artisan even observed 3 years of mourning for his teacher, and he casted a statue in iron to offer daily respect. In the same vein, Yi Yi espoused artisanship by practicing blacksmithing in his late years. A close affiliate of his wrote that when Master Yulgok lived in Haeju, he took up smithing to make agricultural implements and sold them to support himself. About this, a later commentator felt compelled to clarify, saying, if righteousness called for it, as in this case, he was an impoverished scholar needing to feed his family, Confucian gentlemen should not be ashamed of doing this. The subtle embrace of artisanship by the scholar, however, was also mirrored by another scholar turned brassmith, Han Sun-ge. As one of his contemporaries noted with admiration, Han was a benevolent and filial gentleman who was gifted in poetry and fit to become a great scholar. However, declining the opportunity, Han remarked that, if I stop making brassware, my aged mother will starve. Instead, Han continued to make, quote, artifacts that were perfect and did not haggle with his customers, end quote. And after becoming successful, that is by working diligently and being frugal, Han did not hesitate to share his wealth with other members of his family that needed it. So we do not know to what extent these stories are exaggerated or distorted to fit the touchstones of Neo-Confucian morality. For example, Han's style name, Shi-in, which might be scholarly recluse in the market, was yet another trope, right? With multiple actually individuals that were associated with this style name. But that is precisely my point. If artisans were wicked and causing moral catastrophe in the dynasty before, they were now agents of morality. At least one of them made it to the prestigious Confucian Academy, but they could also be found in the marketplace amidst the peddling merchants and the din of metal clanging in brass working shops. So let's wrap up. Today, I've argued that we got many things wrong about the 16th century regarding the artisans, the factories, and even some effects of Neo-Confucianism. Things weren't failing, they were changing. Koreans weren't turning inward, they were responding to global entanglement. There was, to be sure, the trauma of a terrible king, Yeonsan, and the confusions of the Silver Age. But the 16th century was a productive period of moral discourse, material production, and most importantly, the close entanglement of the two. In fact, we might even suggest that the rise of Neo-Confucianism in Korea should be understood in this context of the dialectics between the foreign and domestic, material and ideological. But that's not the book I'm writing, at least not currently. Rather, I continue this story in my book to show that the new alliance of artisans and scholars were temporary. Eventually, it was replaced by the emergence of a permanent group of experts who straddled the two, wielding the so-called artisanal heart or 장심. These experts were capable of undertaking new technologies and embodied both mental and manual vigor. They would transform craft into a form of textual and visual scholarship, which culminated the initial marriage of artisans and scholars in the 16th century that we examine today. So thank you for listening, and I look forward to your questions and comments.